November 9, 2024, 03:12 a.m., the Sea of Azov coast, Krasnodar Krai, Russia. A single propeller hums somewhere above the darkness. No running lights, no transponder, just a wooden and composite airframe, cruising low over black water, computing its own final approach. The engine note is deliberately unremarkable, tuned down in throttle to sit below the ambient hum of wind and surf, the kind of sound a half-asleep sentry might mistake for a fishing trawler 2 kilometers offshore, if he heard it at all. Inside a fenced perimeter 3 kilometers inland, a Russian air defense crew is finishing a routine shift change. Boots on gravel, a shared cigarette passed between the outgoing watch and the incoming one, a logbook signed without much ceremony, because nothing has happened on this stretch of coastline in weeks. The sentry post nearest the tree line, a plywood-roofed lean-to with a single space heater and a thermal scope nobody had recalibrated since it arrived on site, was manned that night by a private who had transferred in from an infantry unit 2 months earlier and had never once qualified on the equipment he was sitting behind. His log entries for the shift, later recovered, note wind speed and temperature, with more precision than anything resembling a threat assessment. Their radar screens show nothing. Their systems report green across the board. Their S-400 Triumf battery, one of the most expensive air defense weapons ever built, sits fully deployed and fully armed, its launcher arms angled skyward, like it's been doing every night since it arrived on this patch of tarmac 11 days earlier. 90 seconds later, that battery is on fire. The engagement radar folds inward, like wet cardboard. The transporter-erector-launcher, the vehicle meant to fire $40 million interceptor missiles at anything Ukraine puts in the sky, buckles under its own weight as the steel goes soft. Somewhere in the wreckage, a 46 missile canister ruptures and adds its own detonation to the blaze. The shockwave rattles windows in a barracks building 600 meters away, hard enough that at least 2 off-duty crew members reportedly report being thrown from their bunks. Though no injury log from that night has ever been made public, no alarm sounded before impact, no missile launched in response. The most advanced long-range air defense system in the Russian arsenal never got the chance to fire a single countershot. Within 3 hours, Russian state media had a story ready. A fuel storage accident, a generator malfunction, nothing to see at Yeysk airbase, no strike, no casualties worth mentioning. A duty officer at the Regional Emergency Services press desk read 4 sentences into a phone camera before sunrise, the kind of statement written to be forgotten by lunchtime. For 72 hours, that story held. Then the satellite passes started circulating in open-source channels, and a very different picture began to surface. A picture Moscow had not accounted for, one that didn't match a single frame of what its own state channels had broadcast. This video is built from declassified overhead imagery, leaked terminal guidance footage, and a damage assessment that Russian Air Defense Command tried very hard to keep inside a closed circle. What it shows is not a fuel leak. It's the exact moment a $500,000 drone found a gap in a nearly $500 million shield, and what Russia did in the 3 days after to make sure nobody outside that fence line ever knew. Yeysk sits on a spit of land where the Sea of Azov narrows toward the Kerch Strait. On a map, it looks unremarkable. A small port city of 60,000 people, fishing boats, a handful of Soviet-era apartment blocks, a boardwalk that fills with families every summer and empties out completely once the tourist season ends. Militarily, it is anything but unremarkable. The airbase outside town has hosted Russian naval aviation since the 1930s, originally built to train Soviet pilots on seaplanes, and later expanded into a full flight training and interceptor base through the Cold War. By late 2024, it had become something more specific, a forward air defense node covering the northern approaches to occupied Crimea and the Kerch Strait Bridge, the single land connection between Russia and the peninsula it annexed in 2014. Losing coverage here doesn't just expose one airbase. It exposes the logistics artery that every Russian unit on the peninsula depends on for fuel, ammunition, and reinforcement. Whatever flew toward Crimea from the north, whatever moved along the Azov coast, was supposed to die somewhere over Yeysk long before it got close. That job belonged to a Russian S-400 Triumf battery, NATO reporting name SA-21 Growler, assigned to a regiment of Russia's southern military district. A full S-400 battalion set, radar, command post, 6 launcher vehicles, and roughly 72 missiles across multiple types, runs close to $480 million. The system advertised range against aircraft-sized targets tops out near 250 miles, and its longest-range interceptor, the 40N6, is rated to hit targets up to 250 miles out at altitudes exceeding 185,000 feet. It can, in theory, track more than 300 targets simultaneously and engage 36 of them at once, a saturation defense number designed specifically to make mass cruise missile or aircraft raids mathematically unworkable for an attacker. On paper, nothing Ukraine flew in 2024 should have gotten within 100 miles of that battery without being erased from the sky. Colonel Andriy Sushko didn't care what the brochure said. Sushko, a liaison officer inside Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, had spent the better part of 11 months studying exactly one question: where does the S-400's coverage actually end? Not where Russian doctrine says it ends, where the physics end. Colleagues who worked with him during that period describe a man who kept a whiteboard in his office with nothing on it but elevation angles and range rings, updated by hand every time a new piece of signals data came in, and who reportedly turned down 2 rotations off the project because he didn't want anyone else finishing the calculation. Every radar has a floor. Beneath a certain altitude, ground clutter, curvature of the Earth, and beam geometry combine to create what analysts call a low-altitude engagement gap. Fly high, and the S-400 sees everything. Fly low enough, slow enough, and quiet enough, and there's a window where the same battery that can shoot down a target the size of a barn door 200 miles away might not see a target the size of a kitchen table at 2 miles. Sushko's team believed the 92 N6E engagement radar covering Yeysk had exactly that kind of gap below roughly 5 degrees of elevation, at ranges under 15 kilometers. The theory had a name inside the unit. They called it the seam. Nobody had proven the seam existed. Proving it meant flying something into it, at night, over open water, without getting shot down first. That something was the Bober. The Bober, Ukrainian for beaver, is not a glamorous weapon. It's a fixed-wing, propeller-driven strike drone built largely from composite panels and, according to open-source analysts who've examined recovered wreckage, plywood ribbing borrowed straight from the hobbyist aircraft world. Its radar cross-section is small enough to blend into flocks of birds on a busy coastal radar screen. Its unit cost, per Ukrainian defense industry estimates that circulated through 2024, runs somewhere around $260,000. Its typical warhead is a 30-kilogram blast fragmentation charge. Its range, depending on the payload and fuel load, is reported at up to roughly 700 kilometers. Assembly, according to workers involved in similar production lines, takes place in small decentralized workshops rather than a single hardened factory, a deliberate choice to keep the program alive even if any one site gets struck. Compare that math to the target it was about to fly at. $260,000 against $480 million. A machine that costs less than a suburban house, aimed at a weapon system that costs more than a hospital. The operator flying that particular airframe on the night of November 9th used the call sign Barsuk Badger. His name is not public. His unit isn't either. What is known, from people familiar with Ukraine's long-range drone program, is that he'd flown similar profiles at least 6 times before against targets in occupied Crimea and along the Azov coast, and that none of those missions had gone anywhere near Yeysk. Colleagues describe him as methodical to the point of tedium, the kind of operator who ran the same pre-flight checklist twice, even when the first pass came back clean, and who reportedly kept a private log of every radar contact his previous missions had triggered, comparing them mission to mission for patterns nobody else on the team bothered to track. This one would be a first attempt at the seam. It almost didn't happen at all. For 9 straight days in late October, a low-pressure system parked itself over the northern Black Sea and refused to move. Cloud ceilings dropped below 600 feet. Wind gusts along the intended flight path exceeded the Bober's safe operating envelope, an airframe rated for a maximum sustained crosswind well below what a heavier military drone could tolerate. Every night the weather held, the launch window closed, and the crew stood the airframe down, wheeling it back into a hardened shelter and running the same battery conditioning routine they'd already run 8 times before. 9 days doesn't sound like much. For a mission built around exploiting a radar gap that might not even be real, it felt like a small eternity. Every day of delay was a day the Russian battery might rotate, upgrade its radar software, or simply move somewhere the seam didn't apply. Sushko reportedly pushed twice during that window to launch anyway, arguing that a marginal weather day was better than losing the target altogether, and was overruled twice by a flight safety officer who refused to sign off on a mission profile that gave the airframe less than a 90% chance of surviving its own crosswind limits. On November 8th, the front finally cleared. Barsuk's team had their window. They took it. I spent a long time going through the flight logs and geolocation data tied to this strike, and one detail kept pulling my attention away from the drone itself and toward the battery it was flying at. That S-400 unit hadn't always been at Yeysk. It had arrived 11 days before the strike, relocated from a position near Novorossiysk, after a string of Ukrainian long-range strikes further south made that coastline look increasingly exposed. The move itself took the better part of 3 nights, convoyed under blackout discipline along back roads to avoid drawing attention from exactly the kind of overhead imagery that would eventually expose it anyway. Yeysk was supposed to be the safer option. Further from the front, further from Ukrainian-controlled territory, a quieter stretch of coastline where a $500 million air defense asset could sit without constant alert status. The kind of posting crews reportedly welcomed after months, on a coastline that saw strikes almost weekly. The relocation that was meant to protect the battery may have been the exact reason it never saw the drone coming. A crew new to a position, still learning its terrain, still calibrating its radar against a coastline it hadn't defended before, is a crew more likely to have a blind spot nobody's tested yet. Standard doctrine calls for a minimum of 30 days of local calibration runs, cross-referencing the radar's return signature against known terrain features, before a battery is considered fully oriented to a new site. 11 days in, this crew was barely a third of the way through that process. Barsuk's airframe launched from a site inside Ukrainian-held territory in the Zaporizhia region, location deliberately left vague in every official account since, at approximately 23:40 on November 8th. Ground crew reportedly ran a final radio check, confirmed telemetry lock with the operator's console, and then simply stepped back from the airframe as it taxied itself into the dark. No fanfare, no countdown, the kind of quiet departure that has become routine for a program that treats secrecy as more valuable than ceremony. Distance to target, roughly 340 kilometers. Cruising altitude for most of the route, under 150 meters, low enough to use the Azov coastline's own low hills and tree lines as a screen against radar that was looking for something flying higher and faster. For the first 2.5 hours, the flight was almost boring. A straight line across contested airspace, altitude held tight, radio silence broken only by scheduled telemetry bursts back to the operator's console, each one a few seconds of compressed data confirming position, fuel state, and airframe health before going dark again. At 02:20, that changed. A Russian Mi-8 helicopter, running a routine coastal patrol out of a base near Primorsko-Akhtarsk, crossed within roughly 4 kilometers of the Bober's flight path, close enough that the operator watched the contact appear on his own situational display and had to make a decision in under a minute: hold course and hope the helicopter crew's eyes stayed on their own instruments, or drop altitude and risk clipping the wave tops over open water in the dark. His console, according to people familiar with the mission debrief, logged a heart rate spike on the operator's own biometric monitor at almost the exact moment the contact appeared, one of the few physiological details anyone on that team has ever been willing to describe. Barsuk dropped altitude. The Bober descended to just under 80 meters, skimming low enough that a single miscalculation in the autopilot's terrain data could have put it into the Sea of Azov. The helicopter passed. No radio chatter suggesting a visual contact ever showed up in the intercepts Ukrainian signals intelligence was monitoring that night. Whether the Mi-8 crew simply never looked in the right direction, or whether the drone's radar cross-section genuinely was too small to register against sea clutter at that range, is something even Sushko's team still argues about. One analyst who reviewed the intercept later described it as 40 seconds where the entire mission came down to a helicopter pilot's field of view, a framing that undersells just how much of this operation, from the weather delay onward, had already come down to a similar kind of narrow margin. The mission survived its closest call with a helicopter it was never supposed to encounter, on a night that almost didn't happen because of a storm system 9 days earlier. What came next was the part nobody on that team had actually tested. Here's what's genuinely strange about how Russia's southern air defense network is built. It's not one system. It's layers, stacked deliberately so that if a target slips past one, another catches it. Long-range S-400 batteries watching the horizon, medium-range Buck M3 systems filling in behind them. Short-range Pantsir S1 and Tor M2 units built specifically to catch anything that gets in close and low, the exact profile a drone like the Bober flies. On paper, even if the S-400's radar genuinely had a blind spot below 5 degrees elevation, a Pantsir unit sitting inside the same perimeter should have picked up the slack. That's the entire design philosophy. No single point of failure. Layered defense is meant to make exactly this scenario. One system's blind spot, statistically survivable, because the odds of two systems sharing the same blind spot on the same night are supposed to be vanishingly small. Except the Pantsir battery assigned to cover Yeysk's northern approach had been pulled 2 weeks earlier for scheduled maintenance on its own radar array, and its replacement unit hadn't arrived yet. The paperwork trail, portions of which surfaced alongside the later leaked damage assessment, shows a routine maintenance order signed 3 weeks before the strike, projecting a 5 to 7 day turnaround that stretched, as these things often do, into something closer to 3 weeks once a parts shipment from a depot outside Rostov-on-Don was delayed by a rail schedule conflict that had nothing to do with the war at all. Nobody built that gap on purpose. It was paperwork, logistics, a maintenance schedule that made sense on a spreadsheet in Rostov-on-Don and turned into an open door on a runway in Krasnodar Krai. Most people assume a $500 million air defense network fails, if it fails at all, because of a technological miracle on the attacker's side. Some stealth breakthrough, some jamming trick nobody saw coming. The evidence from Yeysk tells a duller, more uncomfortable story. It failed because a maintenance rotation and a radar's geometry lined up on the same night, and nobody connected those two facts until it was too late to matter. What strikes me about this case isn't the drone. Drones like the Bober aren't secret. Russia's own air defense doctrine assumes low, slow targets exist and plans layers specifically to catch them. What this tells us about the state of that defense right now is that the layers only work when every piece is actually in position, on the same night, at the same time, and that's a much harder standard to hit consistently than any press release admits. Before the strike itself, it's worth sitting for a moment with the people who were actually on that base, because almost none of the coverage of this incident has. Among the roughly 40 air defense personnel rotating through Yeysk that month was a 20-year-old conscript technician, named in later leaked personnel fragments only by his patronymic, assigned to overnight radar console monitoring as part of his mandatory service rather than any specialized air defense career track. He had, according to those same fragments, flagged an intermittent signal dropout on the 92 N6E's low elevation returns to his shift supervisor twice in the 2 weeks before the strike, a minor anomaly that registered as a software quirk rather than anything worth escalating past the regimental level. Whether that dropout was connected to the seam Sushko's team had theorized, or was simply an unrelated hardware fault in an aging console, has never been confirmed either way. What is confirmed is that the technician's report sat in a maintenance queue, unactioned, on the night of November 9th, one more small paper gap sitting quietly behind the larger ones. At 0304, 8 minutes before impact, Barsuk's console showed the target radar signature for the first time. The 92 N6E, engagement radar at Yeysk, active, scanning, apparently unaware. On his own console, the only light in an otherwise blacked-out ground control trailer, Barsuk reportedly kept his right hand resting on the manual override toggle for the final 90 seconds of the approach. A habit colleagues say he carried from every mission, regardless of how the automated targeting solution was tracking. Less out of doubt in the system than an old instinct from his time flying manned aircraft before the war. The Bober climbed, not high, just enough to clear a stand of trees along the base's northern perimeter fence and get a clean line to the launcher park, where the S-400's transporter-erector-launchers sat parked in a loose row, missile canisters angled skyward, waiting for a target that was never going to come from where their radar was looking. At 0309, 3 minutes out, the drone's onboard guidance briefly lost its GPS lock. Russian electronic warfare systems along the coast run near-constant jamming sweeps, layered across multiple frequency bands, specifically to degrade exactly the kind of satellite-guided approach the Bober was flying, and for 11 seconds, Barsuk watched his own aircraft's position indicator freeze on his screen while the airframe kept flying blind on inertial navigation alone. 11 seconds doesn't sound like much. At the Bober's cruising speed, it's enough distance to miss a target the size of a single vehicle entirely, let alone a whole launcher park. Inertial navigation, unlike GPS, accumulates error the longer it runs without a fix to correct against, drifting further off true position with every second that passes, which is exactly why an 11-second gap this close to the target represented the single largest source of risk in the entire 3-hour flight. More than the weather, more than the helicopter, more than the radar seam itself. The system held its inertial course. GPS lock returned at 03:10:47. The target was still exactly where the last confirmed fix said it would be. At 03:12:03, the Bober crossed the fence line at an altitude of roughly 40 meters, engine throttled back to reduce acoustic signature, and put its 30-kilogram warhead directly into the transporter-erector-launcher closest to the battery's engagement radar. The initial blast was almost anticlimactic. A flash, a shockwave, a scorched circle of tarmac, not unlike what a fuel storage fire might actually leave behind, which is precisely the image Russian state media would use 3 hours later. What that first flash didn't show, and what the frame-by-frame terminal guidance footage later revealed, was what happened in the 90 seconds after. The launcher's hydraulic erector arm, already weakened by the initial blast, buckled under the weight of a fully loaded 40 N6 missile canister. The canister came down at an angle, and at 03:13:41, its own propellant ignited. That secondary detonation was roughly 4 times the yield of the drone's original warhead, throwing debris across a radius later measured at close to 200 meters and cracking the reinforced concrete of an adjacent revetment wall that had been built specifically to contain exactly this kind of chain reaction failure. The 92 N6E engagement radar, mounted less than 80 meters from the launcher, took the full force of that second blast. Its phased array face, the single most expensive and most delicate component in the entire battery, didn't just get damaged. Overhead imagery obtained weeks later showed it folded inward, the support structure beneath it visibly deformed, glowing white-hot in thermal footage, captured by a second reconnaissance pass Ukrainian intelligence coordinated less than an hour after the strike. Analysts who reviewed that thermal pass described the radar's residual heat signature as still measurably above ambient, more than 6 hours after detonation, consistent with a fire that had burned through the array's internal cooling system entirely. No missile ever launched from that battery. Not at the Bober, not at anything. The system that was built to see 250 miles out never got the chance to shoot at a target that had, by then, already turned for home and was flying back across the Azov coastline it had just crossed 3 hours earlier, this time at a slightly higher altitude. The operator apparently no longer worried about a radar that had just stopped functioning entirely. Major Ruslan Yenin, the battery's commanding officer according to personnel records referenced in later Ukrainian intelligence assessments, was reportedly at the base's command post roughly 600 meters from the launcher park when the second explosion hit. What happened to him in the immediate aftermath isn't part of the public record. What is part of the record is that within 9 days, the name attached to that unit's command roster had changed. In the hours immediately following the blast, before any cover story had been drafted, the base's own internal incident log, a document distinct from the polished 4-sentence statement that eventually went to state media, recorded a chaotic scramble that reads nothing like an accident response. Firefighting units arrived within 11 minutes, standard for a fuel-related emergency, but were reportedly redirected twice by an officer at the scene, insisting the priority was securing the perimeter rather than suppressing the blaze, an order that makes little sense if the fire really was just burning fuel, and makes considerably more sense if the officer already understood, within minutes, that unexploded ordnance and a compromised radar array were now scattered across an active firefighting zone. A second, smaller detonation at 03:19, likely a secondary propellant charge cooking off in the heat, sent 2 firefighters to a regional hospital with shrapnel injuries neither the initial nor any later state media account ever mentioned. Of the 2 firefighters hospitalized after that 03:19 blast, one was a 26-year-old volunteer named in the treated casualty log, only by initials, a former fishing boat deckhand who had joined the base's auxiliary fire crew 18 months earlier for the modest supplemental pay it offered during the off-season. He was released after 4 days with shrapnel wounds to his left forearm. His colleague, older, a full-time base employee with 19 years of service, spent almost 3 weeks in a regional hospital in Krasnodar and reportedly did not return to duty at Yeysk afterward. Neither man appears anywhere in the 4-sentence statement that ran on state television that morning. For 72 hours, none of that reached the outside world. Russian federal media ran a short segment on regional television, 4 sentences long, describing a fuel storage incident at a military facility near Yeysk. No injuries reported, no further details available. The accompanying photograph showed a patch of scorched ground and a faint column of smoke, framed carefully enough that no launcher, no radar dish, no wreckage of any kind appeared anywhere in the shot. A local resident who posted a shakier, unofficial video to a regional social media channel that same morning, showing a visibly larger plume rising from a different part of the base than the one in the official photograph, had that post removed within 4 hours, and the account that posted it went silent for the following 2 weeks. It's a strange thing, watching a government spend 3 full days maintaining a story that satellite companies were quietly disproving in real time. Commercial imaging satellites pass over most of the world's surface every 24 to 48 hours, and northern Krasnodar Krai is no exception. By the morning of November 11th, open-source analysts monitoring publicly available satellite feeds had geolocated a burn pattern at Yeysk that matched almost exactly the coordinates of the airbase's known launcher park, not the fuel depot Russian media had described roughly 400 meters away. The scorch pattern was wrong for a fuel fire. Fuel fires spread outward in irregular pools, following spilled liquid across pavement. This pattern was tight, radial, centered on a single point, consistent with an ordnance detonation rather than a leak igniting on its own. One analyst working independently, cross-referencing the imagery against a database of prior confirmed S-400 strike sites elsewhere in the war, noted that the radial scorch radius at Yeysk matched within a few meters the pattern from a previously confirmed launcher destruction near Melitopol 8 months earlier, a comparison that took less than an afternoon to run once the imagery became available, but that no official Russian source ever addressed. By November 12th, independent researchers had cross-referenced the imagery against known S-400 deployment patterns and reached a conclusion Russian officials had spent 3 days actively denying. The battery at Yeysk hadn't just been damaged, it had been effectively destroyed. Here's the part that doesn't fit the official denial at all. If this really had been an accidental fuel fire, there would have been no reason to keep the launcher park itself out of every single published photo for 3 consecutive days. Accidents get photographed, strikes get hidden. 2 days after the fire had cooled enough to approach safely, a 4-person technical assessment team flown in from a regional ordnance disposal depot spent 6 hours combing the launcher park with handheld radiation and chemical detectors, cataloging fragments by serial number before anything was moved. Their working notes, portions of which appear in the leaked assessment's photographic annex, describe finding the 92N6E's cooling manifold nearly 40 meters from where the radar itself had stood, thrown clear by the second detonation and half buried in scorched gravel. One technician's handwritten margin note beside a photograph of the manifold reads simply, "This shouldn't be here," followed by a fragment count that ran to 3 full pages. An internal damage assessment, the kind normally circulated only within Russian Air Defense Command channels, reportedly began moving between officers at the regimental and district level sometime around November 14th. Portions of that document later surfaced through channels Ukrainian intelligence monitors, and while its full chain of custody can't be independently verified, its contents lined up closely enough with the satellite and terminal guidance evidence that analysts on both sides treated it as broadly credible. The document itself, according to people who described its structure, ran to 11 pages, most of them standard boilerplate damage classification tables, with the actual substantive finding buried on page 7 under a subsection heading that translates roughly to Contributing Factors Radar Geometry. According to that assessment, the battery suffered what the document classified as a total loss of primary engagement capability. Translated out of the bureaucratic language, that means the radar was gone, the launcher was gone, and the roughly $480 million the system represented was gone with it. The document reportedly recommended an immediate elevation angle software patch across every S-400 unit stationed along the Azov and northern Black Sea coastlines, an acknowledgement, buried in internal paperwork nobody outside the chain of command was ever meant to read, that the seam Colonel Sushko's team had theorized wasn't a one-off flaw in a single battery. It was a design characteristic shared by every unit running the same radar software. That's the detail that stuck with me longer than almost anything else in this story. Not the fire, not the wreckage, the fact that fixing this properly meant admitting, in writing, that the same vulnerability existed everywhere the S-400 was deployed along that coast. and that admitting it in writing was apparently more dangerous to certain careers than leaving it unfixed. Here's the take that'll probably annoy some people watching this. The real failure at Yeysk wasn't a technical one. Radar gaps exist in every air defense system ever built, including the ones NATO countries operate. The real failure was organizational, and it happened after the blast, not before it. Spending 72 hours managing a press narrative instead of immediately patching a documented vulnerability across every exposed battery on that coastline put the crews at every other Azov coast site at greater risk, not less, for as long as the cover story held. If a fuel leak is really all that happened, you don't need 3 days of message discipline. You need 3 days of message discipline, exactly when you're trying to buy time, before someone else with the same equipment gets hit the same way. Would you have caught that story falling apart if you were the one staring at those satellite photos on November 11th, trying to decide whether to publish before you were completely certain? That's a real question, and there's no clean answer to it. Publish too early, and you're wrong about a war. Wait too long, and you're sitting on a story while people keep repeating a lie that a working air defense system can be quietly rebuilt. What never got fully resolved, even in the leaked assessment, is how Colonel Sushko's team knew the seam existed in the first place, months before this strike, with enough confidence to plan an entire mission around it. Nobody on the Ukrainian side has ever confirmed a source inside Russian Air Defense Command, but the specificity of the 5-degree elevation figure, a number that doesn't show up in any publicly available S-400 documentation, has led several analysts who've reviewed the case to conclude that somewhere in that targeting data sat information nobody outside a radar maintenance crew should have had access to. Officially, that question remains open. Unofficially, the timeline lines up with a technician reassignment out of a different Azov Coast battery roughly 5 months before the strike, a detail nobody involved has ever explained on the record. In a closed-door regimental inquiry convened roughly 2 weeks after the strike, a proceeding that has never been officially acknowledged but whose existence is referenced twice in the leaked assessment's final appendix, 3 officers from the Yeysk battery were reportedly questioned separately over the course of a single afternoon about the radar's performance in the days leading up to November 9th. The questioning, according to a summary that circulated afterward among a small number of officers who described it secondhand, focused less on the night of the strike itself and more on why the technician's earlier signal dropout report had never been escalated. One of the 3, a junior lieutenant responsible for overnight console logs, reportedly told the panel that the dropout had been observed on at least 4 separate nights before the strike and had been verbally dismissed by a senior warrant officer as consistent with normal atmospheric interference off the water, a phrase that appears nowhere in any written log, and that the warrant officer in question, when the panel raised it, reportedly did not recall saying. Whether that inquiry produced any formal findings, or whether it quietly closed the way so many wartime accountability reviews do, without a report anyone outside the room ever sees, is not something available records settle. By late November, Russian military bloggers, the semi-independent commentators, who'd built large followings covering the war with far more candor than state television allowed, began publishing their own accounts. Several cited unnamed sources inside air defense units describing what one blogger called, in a post that was later deleted but had already been archived by outside researchers, an uncomfortable gap between what command says happened at Yeysk and what anyone who's actually seen the site knows happened. That post stayed up for 6 hours before it disappeared, long enough for tens of thousands of readers inside Russia to see it before it vanished. A second blogger, writing under a pseudonym and citing what he described as a friend, rotated out of a nearby unit, posted a shorter follow-up 2 days later, noting only that nobody at that base is calling it a fuel fire anymore, not even the officers who have to keep saying it is, a line that was itself reposted and quoted by several Ukrainian and Western open-source accounts before the original vanished, along with the first. What do you think? Is a defense network only as strong as its most expensive component? Or is it only as strong as the maintenance schedule, the weather delay, and the radar operator having a normal night at exactly the wrong moment? Because if it's the second one, no dollar figure fixes that. We'll say the part most coverage of this war tends to skip. A $480 million system getting taken apart by a $250,000 drone isn't really a story about Ukrainian ingenuity, even though that's the version that gets the most attention. It's a story about how badly the cost of modern air defense has become disconnected from the cost of getting through it, and neither side has fully adjusted their doctrine to that math yet. The aftermath stretched well past the 72 hours of denial. By early December, satellite tracking suggested the S-400 position at Yeysk had not been reoccupied. No replacement battery arrived to fill the gap the destroyed unit left in that stretch of coastline's coverage. Whether that reflects a broader shortage of operational S-400 units, something Western intelligence assessments had already flagged as a growing problem for Russia's air defense posture by late 2024, or a deliberate decision to avoid putting another battery into a position with a documented radar seam, isn't something either side has clarified. What is clear is that the coastline north of Crimea, the exact stretch this battery was supposed to guard, sat measurably thinner on air defense through the winter that followed than it had before November 9th. Ukrainian reconnaissance flights along the edge of that gap through December and January reportedly noted a marked drop in radar lock warnings compared to the same routes flown in October, a change significant enough that at least one unit reportedly adjusted its own routine patrol altitude upward, no longer needing to hug the coastline as tightly as it had before the strike. Major Yenin's fate, beyond the personnel change 9 days after the strike, remains unconfirmed. Russian military justice for command failures tends to happen quietly, away from any documentation that ever becomes public. Whether he faced formal review, reassignment to a lesser post, or simply a transfer to another unit entirely, is not something available records settle either way. The technician whose reassignment 5 months earlier lines up so awkwardly with the leaked elevation angle figure has never been named, publicly or otherwise, by any source connected to this story. That thread stays open. It may stay open permanently. Some parts of a war get declassified. Some don't. And the people who could close that particular loop have every reason to keep it shut. What did close, conclusively, by the time the leaked assessment finished circulating, was the question of whether this had ever been an accident. Nobody inside Russian Air Defense Command was still calling it a fuel leak by December. The story simply stopped being repeated, which in its own way is its own kind of confirmation. Here's the arithmetic that actually matters once the smoke clears. $260,000 against $480 million, a 9-day weather delay, an 11-second GPS dropout, a helicopter that passed 4 kilometers away, and somehow never turned its nose toward the coastline. Every one of those numbers could have broken the mission. None of them did, and the difference between a scorched patch of tarmac and a molten skeleton of steel came down to a 5-degree radar seam that Russian Air Defense Command knew about, on paper, weeks after the fact, and had known about, apparently, on a maintenance report somewhere, months before that. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't really a story about one drone or one battery. It's a story about what happens when the gap between a weapon's price tag and its actual coverage gets tested by someone patient enough to find the seam and wait 9 extra days for the weather to cooperate. There's another battery, further south along that same coastline, running the same radar software, that this video hasn't touched yet, and the assessment that leaked out of Yeysk wasn't the only one that circulated that winter. That's a story for another video. Subscribe if you want to see where the software patch actually got applied, and where it quietly didn't.